It's the amazing Rico Brogna podcast with your host, Evan Roberts.
Rico Brogna! Another brand spanking new edition of Rico Brogna. I am your host. If you're not familiar with me, my name is not Rico Brogna. I'm Evan Roberts. Rico Brogna was a legendary Gold Glove caliber first baseman for the New York Mets, and this podcast is named after greatness. So we named it after Rico Brogna. Pete Hoffman, who does a fine job producing the Rico, is in a very special circumstance right now. He's in Germany. We are recording this. If you're watching on YouTube, it's live for you. If you're listening on the podcast, downloading it maybe a day or two later, this is not live for you. So I'll describe the situation. We are recording this on a Friday night. For me, it's a little after 11 o'clock. For Pete Hoffman, it is 5 a.m. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, what the hell is Pete Hoffman doing at 5 a.m.? The answer is drunk. He was hitting all of those beer gardens, I guess they're called in Germany, and he's had quite a few drinks. Would you like to say hello to your loyal Ricoers, Pete?
And I look at this. I still have a beer in hand.
Look at that. At 5 a.m.? It's damn impressive. But you know what? Since you flew in yesterday from the United States of America, it's not really 5 a.m. for you. It's 11 o'clock, right? Isn't that a good way to look at it?
Yeah, I'm very, listen, the world is very upside down at the moment. That's all I'm saying.
I understand. So when Pete offers Met opinions today, I want you to understand that he's half in a bag. So do not hold Pete, too much for what he actually says on this edition of Rico Brogna.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I that means a lot.
So a couple of things we're going to do on this, Rico. David Stearns was at the GM meetings, obviously. He met the media on multiple occasions. So Pete actually did a great job of editing all of everything that he said. And we are going to listen back to a good portion of what David Stearns had to say. You'll get to hear it, and then we'll quickly analyze it. So it's one of those things, we've done this before, where if you hadn't heard what David Stearns said, great, it's new to you. Even if you have, though, you're going to hear instant kind of reaction to everything he had to say. And obviously, David Stearns was asked about a myriad of topics. But before we get there, I want to address some rumors. Rumor number one, and that came out, I guess it was late Thursday, from somebody I'm not familiar with. And I don't want to say the guy's a fraud because I don't know if that's true. But there was a report from someone I wasn't familiar with. It gained a lot of attention that the New York Mets were heavily aggressive after Willy Adames. In fact, this guy even specifically said the contract, which was 7 years, $160 million. The reporter's name is a guy by the name of Mike Rodriguez. I don't have any ill will towards him. I just don't know him. I can't tell you it's John Heyman. I can't tell you it's Jeff Passan.
He's a fraud.
He's a fraud. I don't know if he's a fraud, but when this was sent to me in my Mets text chat, my initial response was, I don't believe it. I do not believe that the New York Mets, a few days into free agency, would be making a monster offer to Willy Adames. It does not make sense to me. So, number one, I don't necessarily believe the report. Adames, of course, is a free agent. I'm sure that David Stearns checked in on him because I think as a general manager or as a team president, you check in on everybody. It would be almost irresponsible not to. And so according to Mike, and even Mike Mayer, who does a good job reporting, I do believe him, he just simply said the Mets are checking in on Willy Adames. And again, no issue with the checking in. But I do have a few issues when we go deeper into this. Willy Adames had a fine year for the Milwaukee Brewers. Very solid year. In fact, if you're not familiar with his numbers, I'll give them to you right now. He hit .251 with 32 home runs, 112 RBIs. He stole 21 bases. He had an OPS of 794 and a WAR of 3.1. For a shortstop, fine. Very good. I mean, actually a very good year for a National League shortstop. Obviously, if the Mets are pursuing Adames, it would not to be as a shortstop. It would be to move him to third base and subsequently replace Pete Alonzo. Let's not get this twisted. If the Mets are signing Willy Adames, they are replacing Pete Alonzo. The only way they're not replacing Pete Alonzo is if you assume, they'll keep Pete, they'll trade Mark Vientos, which I don't think any Met fan would be up for, or they're DHing Mark Vientos. I don't think that's likely. I do not think the Mets are going to pursue an infielder, especially when they've got a lot of young options as infielders, and do it while keeping Pete Alonso. It doesn't make sense. So when I hear the name Willy Adames, when I looked at the name Willy Adames long before there were any links between the Mets and him, just thinking about him in general, like we would do with any free agent, my initial reaction is I don't necessarily want him because I don't think he's better than Pete Alonso. And I do think you have to think about it in that context. Because again, I don't find it to be realistic that the Mets would be spending $100+ million on Adames to move him to third base and then do what? They're not keeping Pete Alonso. They would be moving Vientos to first base. So this discussion that I want to have with everybody, the reason I'm framing it as Adames versus Alonso is because that's what it would be. As creative as David Stearns is, as open-minded in the offseason as one can be, they're not signing Adames to then keep Pete Alonso. Do we all agree on that? I think most of us should. So now, very quickly, and hopefully I could put this to bed because I don't think it's particularly close, let's have the Adames versus Alonso debate. And I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. Right before I go through these numbers, I don't think it's a very close debate. I don't. I think Pete Alonso is a better option than Willy Adames. I do. Pete Alonso is a year older than Adames, just so we know. Now, as far as defense is concerned, the kind of definable thing, because with offensive numbers, we'll go through them. But with defense, you're speculating on what you think Adames is as a third baseman. I could tell you what he was as a shortstop, average to below average defensively. So what? We're going to assume that Adames is going to third base and he's Brooks Robinson? Is that the assumption we're going to make? He's going to go over to third base and he's freaking Mike Schmidt? I'm not making that assumption. Now, can he go to third base and be average? Probably. Can he go to third base and be slightly better than Mark Vientos? Sure. Could he go to third base with Vientos going to first base and you would think that that infield, or at least that corner portion of Vientos third, Alonso first, is worse defensively than Adames third, Alonso first? Maybe. But it won't be by a lot. Defense does not change this equation too dramatically. But again, if we're talking about defense, just to get this out of the way, it's speculative because he's a shortstop. We haven't seen him play third base, so do not make the assumption he's going to move over to third base and be A-Rod. Just because he's a shortstop and just because he's athletic doesn't mean he goes over to third base and is Scott Rowland. So what I'm telling you is the defense is probably not going to be that significantly different. I don't think Vientos is ever going to turn into a Gold Glover at first base, nor do I think he's ever going to be much better than Pete Alonso, who I think has gotten better every year defensively at first base. So take the defense and let's call it a draw, because it probably is. So now let's go to the offense. I will raise my hand because I want to have an honest conversation, and I would tell you that Willy Adames had a better offensive season than Pete Alonso in 2024, but not by much. If you want to cite to me clutch numbers or how big Adames was in a big spot, sure. We didn't watch him every day. We can look at the stats on Baseball Reference, but one thing we know about Pete in watching him every day is he didn't have a clutch year. I'd be the first to admit it. But take a closer look at the 2024 numbers between Pete Alonso and Willy Adames. One of Willy's best seasons, right? A very good season that he had. OPS. Willy Adames was at 794. Pete Alonso was at 788. I think it's fair to say that's a wash. Let's look at slugging percentage. Willy Adames was 462. Pete was 459, separated by 3 points. Adames gets the edge, but I think we'd agree pretty much a wash. On base percentage, Willy Adames was 331. Pete Alonso was 329. Again, give Willy the edge, it's a wash. Home runs, Pete Alonso hit 34. Willy Adames hit 32. And don't tell me Adames is a shortstop, because for our argument, he's not a shortstop. He's a third baseman. So I don't give a rat's ass about how great his production is for a shortstop. He's not coming to New York to play shortstop. RBIs. Adames had a huge edge. He drove in 112. Pete drove in 88. Obviously, a lot of that is circumstance. A lot of that is opportunities. But a lot of that is clutch. And I give that to Willy Adames. How can you not? He drove in more runs. When it came to batting average, Willy Adames at 251. Pete Alonso at 240. Has him beat by 11 points. When it comes to WAR, which factors in base running, factors in defense, Adames was a 3.1. Pete Alonso was a 2.6. So Adames had a better year. There's no denying that. But it was not a significantly better year. And by the way, would that not concern you, considering we all ripped Pete Alonso's season to shreds and basically said it was not a great year? One thing I also want to point out about Willy Adames is he struck out 173 times last season, which is an awfully high number. You may not care about strikeouts very much. Maybe Major League GMs don't care about strikeouts very much, but that's a lot. And by the way, it was pretty much the same as Pete Alonso. Pete Alonso struck out 172 times. But when you look at Pete Alonso's entire career and you look at Willy Adames's entire career, you would notice that Pete Alonso strikes out at a percentage that is right at the major league average. That may sound surprising, right? Pete Alonso strikes out in his major league career at a 22.8% clip. This past season, it was a little bit higher than that. It was at 24.8. That 22% clip that Pete Alonso strikes out at is the major league average. Think about that for a second. So as much as we think Alonso strikes out a lot, he actually just strikes out a major league average. Now, you're probably asking about Adames. Adames strikes out in his major league career 27% of the time. That's worse. So Willy Adames, let me get this straight, just so we know, just so we're all on the same page. Last year, his wonderful season that people love to talk about. What a great year Willy Adames had. He pretty much averaged what Pete Alonso did in Pete Alonso's bad season. And if you look at Willy Adames's career, I think one would say that was probably the best year of his career. So his career season going into free agency is pretty much equal, but slightly better, but pretty much equal to the horrible, crappy year that the Mets got out of Pete Alonso. I'm not done yet, by the way. That's just 1 year. What if we look back at the last 2 years? What if we did that? What if we took 2024 and 2023 and we added it together and we compared Pete Alonso to Willy Adames? We can do that. That's always fun. When it comes to WAR, Adames has the edge, but very close. 6.1 to 5.7. When it comes to home runs, not close. Pete has 80, Adames has 56. When it comes to RBIs, 206 for Pete, 192 for Adames. When it comes to batting average, Adames edges him out. 235 to 229, neither great. But when it comes to all those other stats, like on base, slugging, and OPS, Pete wins fairly easily. And you want to go to OPS plus, 123 for Pete, 106 for Adames. So over the last 2 years, again, both are pretty much the same age, Pete Alonso has been a better player. You want to go back the last 3 years? It's going to get ugly if we do that, but fine, what do I care? Pete Alonso, 120 home runs, Willy Adames, 87. In fact, Pete Alonso hasn't beaten every single stat except for stolen bases. You want to go back a little bit before that. In fact, why don't we just take their entire careers? Why not? It seems fair. In the entirety of Adames's career, the entirety of Pete Alonso's career. When it comes to WAR, very close. Adames 21.5, Pete about 20, and Adames had played about 50 more games, so it's a counting stat, a little bit higher than Pete. When it comes to home runs, Pete's got him beat by 76, 226 to 50. When it comes to RBIs, 586 to 472. When it comes to batting average, basically a tie, 249 to 248. When it comes to OPS, to me, the kind of the most important stat I look at, depends on the player, 854 to 766. OPS plus, 134 to 109. long-winded. I got to my point. Pete Alonso's a better player than Willy Adames. He just is. If you just want to go by last year, Adames wins, not by much. So walk me through, if you actually want Adames over Alonzo, on the why. Like, what would even be the reason? And that contract that this guy reported, 7 years, 160 for that? And you don't want to get Pete Alonso anywhere close to that? That does not make sense to me. It's not particularly close, especially when you factor in the tiny itsy bitsy thing that Pete has proven he can play here. That Pete has proven he's a New York. I don't know about Willy Adames. None of us do. The guy's played in Tampa and Milwaukee. So I don't know if this is a real thing. I admit that. It doesn't feel like a real thing because the Mets' priority being Willy Adames would be dumb. Like if David Stearns literally said, my priority is locking in Adames on a 7-year contract, he should have his head examined because that can't be your priority. Guys like Adames and Alonzo, I get them being fallbacks depending on what happens with Soto and seeing where the market takes each player. I get that. If Adames has to settle on a 3-year, $60 million contract, despite Pete being the better player, and Pete's getting 7 years, fine. I can see that world where we say, hey, Adames is a better fit based on the contract. But we're not doing it based on, like, I don't know, reality. We're not doing it based on performance. So hopefully I've convinced anybody that was actually on the fence of an Adames-Alonzo debate that Adames would be a better option, because he's not.
The one thing I will argue with, and I hate to do this because I want Pete Alonso here. I think Pete Alonso is such an underrated player, especially for people in New York. Position flexibility. Adames, if he's somebody who is going to be a shortstop or was a shortstop, but then could play third base or second base or somewhere else in the infield, he gives you the flexibility. And that's what I feel like owners and GMs love to see, someone who doesn't just play one spot, but can play other places.
I get what you're saying, and there's no doubt that if Willy Adames is making that position switch from shortstop to third base, and by the way, if you look at his major league career, he's just a shortstop. He hasn't played any of those other positions. He very briefly played second base as a rookie, but that was 7 years ago. So I get the idea of that, but I also don't think that's really going to happen. Like if the Mets sign Willy Adames to a contract like that, he's the third baseman, period, stop. Like, I don't think position versatility is actually going to ever be used for him. I also think it's just slightly overrated. The Mets have a lot of young position players that are probably going to move all over the diamond. Jet Williams is probably going to fit into that role of being second base, outfield. Ronnie Mauricio may end up at second base, third base. You'll hear it with David Stearns. Brett Beatty may end up third base, outfield. So I get that. I just don't think it matters enough. And I think when you're giving somebody a big contract, I do think Adames is going to get a big contract. Like that made up contract I just talked about. I'm not saying that's going to happen. I'm saying that's where I would be more interested in a guy like that. So I'm not concerned because I don't think it's a real thing. I think Adames and Alonzo should both be in that second bucket. And I love Pete. I feel bad saying that. And that is you go after Soto, you see what happens with him, and then based on that, let's see where the market goes for some of these remaining free agents, where it goes for Pete, where it goes for Adames, where it goes for Alex Bregman, where it goes for maybe one of the outfielders like Anthony Santander or Teoscar Hernandez. But the idea that the Mets would make Adames a priority, I certainly hope not, because I don't think he's as good as maybe people think he is. He's coming off one of his best seasons, and his best season is pretty much on par with Pete Alonso, who had one of his worst seasons. Now, I do think a part of this is projecting the future, right? And I have to keep that in mind, that Pete has had some of his more down years over the last couple of years. So you do wonder, okay, well, what is he in 25, 26, and 27? I don't think Pete's done. I don't think he's washed up. I also love the fact, and Adames does this too, Pete does it just better, that he plays every day. And obviously, Pete Alonzo brings that. So if you guys have any thoughts on Willie Adames, certainly you can email us, thericob@gmail.com, and we will read some of those emails on a future Rico Brogna. But let's get to David Stearns. The man, the myth, the legend. He was at the GM meetings. He was asked many, many questions. This will be a multiple-part series when it comes to analyzing David Stearns' answers, because he was asked, I think, about like 80 questions over these 3 days at the GM meeting. So we will split them into multiple episodes. But let's start off with the first question that David Stearns was asked as he was saying, all right, media, ask me whatever you want at the general manager meetings.
For Severino, what ultimately led you to that call?
Yeah, he had a great year. We want him back. This is sort of the first step in that process. And so we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, so the Mets made the qualifying offer to Luis Severino. And look, I love it because I think you're in a win-win-win. Win number one, Luis Severino says, I'm going to accept that qualifying offer. And by the way, players have another 10 days to make said decision. So we're going to get answers on guys who are made the qualifying offer relatively soon. But you've got the win-win-win. So win number one is Luis Severino says, you know what, $21.5 million? Cool, I'm going to come back on a one-year deal. As unlikely as that is, that would be a win. I think most of us would be pretty good at Sevy coming back on another one-year contract to get a bump in salary, but one-year deal for a starting pitcher coming off a very solid season for this team, that's a win. Win number two, they bring him back. They bring him back on a reasonable contract. Great. They get him back on a 2 or 3 year deal, which is probably where I would be when it comes to Luis Severino. Ideally, maybe he's going to get more than this, which means he's gone. I would love to give him a 2-year deal with a vesting option based on innings and health on a 3rd year. Money-wise, probably looking at $17, $18 million, maybe a little bit more than that. But that would be the kind of contract I would give him. And if the Mets are able to work something like that out, great. That's win number 2. Win number 3 is he leaves and you get a draft pick back. That's the beauty of the qualifying offer. And by the way, sticking him with that qualifying offer brings his value down to everybody but us, because obviously bringing him back wouldn't cost anything but the contract. But if you're someone else that brings him in, obviously you lose a draft pick. So I love the decision. Obviously, I believe David Stearns with that answer. They'd love to bring Luis Severino back.
Given what the rotation depth chart looks like at this moment, how many starters do you want to add in the offseason?
Yeah, I think multiple is kind of what I'm going for. How many multiples, I don't know yet. And we talked about this last offseason too. You can build pitching staffs in very different ways. And you can do it via adding starting pitching and going for length at the front end of games. We could structure our bullpen a little bit differently next year, where you've got more multiple inning options that can eat up innings. But certainly we need to find some innings, and a part of that's going to be adding to the starting rotation.
Yeah, to me, it's a minimum 2 if you're just talking about adding starting pitching, because when you think about what the rotation depth is right now, it's Kodai Senga, it's David Peterson. There are other guys who can start. Those guys are just not guaranteed rotation spots. What is Jose Budo? What is Tyler McGill? Guys like that. Some of the prospects that are very, very close, like how close do they think Brandon Sproat is? But I think looking at the depth that they have, it is 2 at the minimum, and then maybe 3, depending on who's out there, depending on price, depending on availability. But I would agree it's at minimum 2.
Mania was pretty close to 1 in the second half, but he made it to the Final Four without, a known true ace. Is that important to you to have an ace?
Look, having a horse at the front end of your rotation always helps. I think Sean served that this year. He had a heck of a year. There were points during this year where Sevy did that for us. So you need starting pitchers to pitch well. I don't know that I'm going to go into it has to be sort of the name brand ace, but you certainly need starting pitchers who can carry the load for you.
Well, I don't know if they had an ace. You know, Sean Manaea pitched very well in the second half of the year, and he made 32 starts, and he threw 180 innings. He had a 3.47 ERA. He had some duds that were mixed in there. And if you want to say, wow, it's really the first half of the year, I don't know if a few months literally makes someone an ace, other than us just saying you're the ace of our rotation, which means everybody has an ace. It's just their number one starter. But what is going to be essential is that the leader for the New York Mets in innings pitched last season was Luis Severino at 182. He's a free agent. The guy who was number two was Sean Manaea at 181.2. So basically, they got the same amount of outs. He was number two, another free agent. And the guy who was third was Jose Quintana at $170. He's a free agent. So your three biggest innings guys, and add that number up, 180, 180, and 170. That's over 500 innings that are free agents. And the next guy who threw the most innings was David Peterson at 121, who missed, obviously, the first few months of the year. And those were the only guys that threw triple digits when it comes to innings. So there are a lot of innings to replace. See, I would love to have an ace. It's not necessarily essential. I mean, the LA Dodgers won a World Series. Who the heck was their ace? Jack Flaherty, Yoshinobu Yamamoto, Walker Buehler. At this point in their careers, none of them were really an ace. But there, to me, is the opportunity for an ace. Corbin Burns certainly qualifies as one. Max Fried would qualify as one. Blake Snell, certainly the last few years, would qualify as one. Those are aces, or at least they're very close to being aces. I don't even think the Mets had an ace last year. They just had guys who pitched well and threw a lot of innings. I don't think David Stearns really gave us much of an answer on how much he wants an ace. I think it's really going to depend on how much does he love Corbin Burns. Mets have already been attached to them. Jim Bowden reported that's the priority of David Stearns. By the way, another report I don't really believe. I think the Mets are so buttoned up right now that they don't let things like that leak out. Let's hear more from David Stearns.
You built the rotation this past year was very successful but it seemed like you guys were in a little bit of a different spot, right? You were kind of feeling out the roster, wanted to be a playoff contender. Do you feel like you have to build it differently in that sense? Like John said, an ace on the front, like does it become more important based on where you guys are at now? Like it's not just as much of maybe a feeling out year as it was a year ago.
Yeah, look, I think the way we built our rotation last offseason, as you said, was successful. I think we're seeking to build another successful rotation, however that occurs. And you can do it in a variety of different ways. So I don't feel beholden to do it in any particular one way.
So to me, because again, David Stearns didn't tell us anything other than I'm trying to build a successful rotation. No crap. I think there are two differences to last year. It's still great to find guys on short-term deals and hit it out of the ballpark like you did with Luis Severino and Sean Manaea. And if you have a good feeling about a pitcher, if you like the way they're trending, if you think you can fix them, if you like them off an injured year or a down year, and it's great value to get them on a one-year deal, those are always great no matter where you are as a team. But here are the two differences. Number one, I think maybe you are more aggressive for one of those top-line starting pitchers because you think your team is closer. But the other thing that's really different, because I was not in on this a year ago, and now I've altered myself because of where the Mets are, is I'd be more open to trading for a young, controllable starting pitcher. I'd be more open to trading for a starting pitcher with 1 year left on their deal. And there are a lot of names that fit that. All you got to do is look at Arizona with Jordan Montgomery and Zach Gallen. Like, yeah, I'd be open to that. Garrett Crochet is a name you've heard a lot about. Yeah, and the Mets could be well positioned to match up on a trade like that, where they're moving guys in their farm system. That's not something I ever thought David Stearns would want to do last year because of the uncertainty of where this team is. So, yeah, you're trying to build a rotation. You're trying to hit it as well as you can like you did last year. You don't also want to get bogged down on long-term contracts to starting pitchers. I said this the other day when we did our Corbin Burns edition. You can download it if you missed it. I'm good with giving one guy a long-term deal in my rotation. It's when you start to give multiple long-term deals. But I think there are different avenues where the Mets can build this rotation this year, and trading is definitely an option. That isn't something I wanted to be as aggressive on last year because we didn't know how good the team would be. I think it's a little bit different this year.
How are you viewing center field this year? Obviously, Bader now free agent. You had moved Nimmo to left. Is that part of the consideration moving him back to center, or would he stay in left field?
I think Brandon did a really nice job in left field, and he also did a nice job occasionally moving over to center and spelling Harrison or Tyrone. For the most part, I think we should expect to see him in left field next year.
Interesting. See, that's an answer right there. That is telling us, now, maybe he's lying to us. Maybe things will change based on what happens during the offseason. But that is Brandon Nimmo is now a left fielder. That's it. And, Brandon's not that old. He's going to turn 32 before the start of the year. And I thought his defense in center field in the limited time we saw him there this past year was not great, nor was it the following year. So I think the Mets are telling you, we want him in left. We'll go defense first in center. Or, as I've talked about, you leave that open for Drew Gilbert or Jet Williams to become the center fielder, because there isn't really a robust center field market. But Brandon Nimmo, coming off of a down year, at least offensively, all his numbers were pretty much down except for home runs. His average was down 50 points. His OPS was down. He's going to be the left fielder and not going to be the center fielder. There's your kind of news from David Stearns.
Where does that leave you as far as center field options? So you just explore free
Yeah,
agency
we'll have to explore free agency and trade. We have a lot of confidence in Tyrone. Tyrone did a very nice job at all three this past year. I think he can do a nice job wherever we ask him to play.
Tyrone Taylor had off-season hernia surgery. He misses a few months. It's obviously the off-season. Should be ready to go for spring training. Tyrone Taylor, ideally, he's a fourth outfielder, as well as he played down the stretch. I said that about Bader last year. I certainly feel that way about Tyrone Taylor. Ideally, he's a fourth outfielder. But because the Mets have these young options in center field, Drew Gilbert, Luis Angel Acuna has played there a little bit, Jet Williams. And I'm not sure which one is going to be the guy, which one is truly the guy that David Stearns looks at and says, that's my center fielder for the next 5 years. Unfortunately, I don't think Gilbert or Jet make the team out of spring training. This year's did not go very well for them in terms of health and production. Nice to see him in the Arizona Fall League playing well, but they're not making the team out of spring training. So Tyrone Taylor being the opening day center fielder is not crazy, because it at least keeps it kind of open without a big contract or a big player for one of those young guys. Acuna is fascinating. Assuming the Mets don't trade Luis Angel Acuna during the offseason, do they view him as a center fielder? Played a little bit of it in AAA. Do they view him more as a second baseman? And Jeff McNeil is gone. But you've got three legitimate young options to play center field. And that's where, look, to me, this offseason, this outfield, it's pretty damn simple the way I view it. Brandon Nimmo is your left fielder. Tyrone Taylor holds down center till one of the kids are ready. And Juan Soto is your right fielder. Is that going to happen? One can only dream. We know that Steve Cohen got the meeting out there. Hal Steinbrenner's got his meeting out there. We'll see what happens. But that's my outfield. It ain't that. And Starling Marte is either traded or is my DH. Probably not trading, because I don't like giving guys away if they don't have a lot of value. But Starling Marte at this point in his career, with the health issues and with how bad he looked defensively in right field, boom, there's your DH. And every once in a while, you could stick him in the outfield. But that would be my plan for center field. And it kind of sounded like that may be David Stearns' plan for center field.
Are any players on the market worth over $500 million?
There are a lot of free agents out there. And I'm sure we will have conversations with a number of different free agents.
That was a wonderful attempt to say, are you ready to sign Juan Soto? Is anyone worth $500 million? I think we can all admit that's the only free agent that's out there that's worth $500 million.
Do you actually, at this point, have you gone far enough to know what, say, plan A looks like for you, plan B, plan C, and now you go into it and start talking to people to see what can be executed?
I think at this stage in the offseason, you have players of interest at all segments of the salary structure, at all segments of free agency, at all segments of trade. I have never structured an offseason with linear plans, plan A, plan B, plan C. I think it's much more fluid than that. And it's very difficult to know exactly how any plan is going to take shape until you begin those conversations and frankly make a transaction. Once you make one transaction, it changes the shape of your entire offseason.
Yeah, I think there are certain aspects of this offseason you could attack without, thinking about your other moves. So, like, for example, the Mets need to build a bullpen. I think we all know that. I think you could start doing that right now. I mean, unless, like, a big-ticket item is really going to keep you from buying a top-end reliever, maybe that would be the only thing that stops it. But, you can go about doing that and building your bullpen and adding the 2 or 3 bullpen arms that you need. But I think it's clear without him saying it, there is a plan A. The plan A is Juan Soto. And yeah, that does change things. Assuming the Mets have some kind of reasonable budget and Steve Cohen isn't saying to David Stearns, go spend $2 billion, I don't care. You would have to think that spending $700 million on a mega contract for one player may alter the way you execute the rest of your offseason. So he'll never reveal what his plan A and plan B or his linear plans are, but we know what it is, Dave. We know what the number one option is.
Can I maybe ask it a different way? Do you go into an off season where you're like, this is the player I'd like to pull down most, whether it's a trade or free agent, and then try to build around that concept?
Not necessarily. I think we go in understanding that there are likely going to be various ways where we can make our team better and add pieces to our team that are going to allow us to compete at a high level. And there are certain players who are going to make a larger impact in that endeavor. But I generally don't get focused on one or two individuals.
Yeah, I don't believe you. I think right now, while you may spread the net wide in checking in on everybody, you are focused on one individual. Your owner is flying out to California next week. You'll probably be in tow to meet with the agent of that said one player that you're probably pretty obsessed with.
Are you going to be more focused on looking at for a first baseman or a third baseman?
I think we'll see how the market plays out. I think we're fortunate. I think we have some infield depth. Obviously, Pete has been a big part of this team for a long time, and certainly we're going to keep in touch with him.
Yeah, it's kind of a coldish answer. I mean, basically, that answer means Pete is thrown in there with everybody else. Christian Walker, Willie Adames, Alex Bregman, Pete Alonzo. We'll keep in touch with all of them. And I think that's where Pete is right now. And that's the truth. Doesn't mean they won't bring him back, but clearly there's no special treatment for Pete Alonzo. They're not prioritizing bringing him back. I think they're prioritizing the other player, the player we've talked about, and then let's see where the prices fall for everybody else. And I always thought this, what's going to determine Pete Alonzo coming back is what his market is. If he ends up getting a mega contract from the Cubs or the Astros, he's gone. If his price tag is relatively down, and remember, he does have the attachment of the qualifying offer. So I don't know if it's going to scare too many teams away, but it's certainly something one has to keep in mind. If his price comes down and it meets the Mets price, he's a New York Met. That's why I don't believe the Adames stuff. I think Adames is kind of in the same boat. I'm not ruling out that the Mets wouldn't sign Willie Adames. I just don't think that they would aggressively try to sign him for a contract more than they offered Pete Alonzo, or in the same stratosphere that they offered Pete Alonzo.
How do you go in as far as the payroll and resources are concerned? I mean, Steve doesn't seem to set any hard and fast parameters, which is something that you weren't used to in the past. So how do you approach that? You just approach what players make sense at what price, as opposed to thinking about what the whole payroll is going to wind up costing at the end?
So we understand we have financial flexibility. We also understand that flexibility is not limitless. There are bounds to what we can do, and there are bounds not only this year, but there are bounds in future years. And we have to be cognizant of all of those bounds. So Steve is going to support what we think are wise baseball initiatives. He's going to support those initiatives as much as any owner in baseball. And now it's our job to execute.
Yeah, the mystery is how far. How much money would Steve Cohen be willing to write in this offseason? That's always the mystery for us as fans when we talk about baseball off seasons. as compared to the NFL or the NBA. There's a cap. There's only so much you can do. So you're kind of arguing how you want to divvy out that money. If Steve Cohen's willing to have, I'm not saying he is, but if he's willing to have a $500 million payroll next year, then sign everybody. Corbin Burns and Max Fried and Pete Alonzo and Juan Soto. So no owner ever tells us that. Hal Steinbrenner certainly doesn't tell that. Brian Cashman doesn't tell that. But that's the real mystery. We know Steve is willing to spend. How far would he be willing to go?
Can I ask you a question? Because we've all heard in the past the Mickey Callaways of the world, the Sandy Aldersons of the world, the prior GMs. Isn't it refreshing to hear David Stearns speak? Because I feel like I almost trust him.
Well, we trust him because his first year was such a success. The truth is, I love doing these Ricos where we analyze everything he says, but the truth is he doesn't say a lot. So we're interpreting what he says. But look, sometimes he says something like he declared Brandon Nimmo's the left fielder. Okay, great. That's a piece of something. But he does a lot of words without actually giving you the meat of it. But yes, I do trust David Stearns. I think his track record certainly speaks for itself with what he did in Milwaukee. And his first year here, he made a lot of good moves. So, yeah, David Stearns is a guy that doesn't annoy me when he speaks. Brody Van Wagenen would say stuff and it would piss us off. And it wasn't just because of what he said. It was because we didn't trust him, because he felt like a used car salesman and things would go badly. And David Stearns certainly does not come across that way.
Do you feel comfortable with Vientos at third, or would you feel comfortable at first? He hasn't really played much first.
Yeah, I think Mark can play both. And to his credit, he's shown that with his work ethic and diligence, he can get better defensively. And so I'd have confidence with Mark at either position.
Yeah, I think David hit on it. Vientos showed you this past year with how okay he was defensively at third base, that he's a hardworking man. You see it on Instagram. He's already posting how hard he's working. And I think the results of last year showed you that. Look, I'd rather have Vientos at third base because it means Pete's here. But I think if they move him to first base, while he'll probably never be Rico Brogna, the namesake of the podcast, I think much like third base, he would certainly turn himself into a decent enough defensive first baseman.
David, after this season you had mentioned, and Carlos had mentioned this too, about running out of gas a little bit, particularly in the pitching staff. Is there anything from like an acquisition standpoint that you take away from that maybe you can apply to this offseason?
So the shape of our season, I think, to some extent contributed to the tank running out a bit earlier than we would have hoped, and we had to push so hard from June 1st on. And our players talked about it even in June, where at times it felt like we were playing playoff games in June and July. I think our group did a tremendous job of carrying that forward deep into October. You never really know when you're going to hit E. And unfortunately, we probably hit E a little earlier than we would have liked.
Yeah, they were. I completely agree with them in that they were playing playoff games since June 1st. They were never offered the luxury of slowing down when it came to their starting pitching. And look, here's the reality. Luis Severino threw 180 innings. Sean Manaea threw 180 innings. Jose Quintana threw 170 innings. They pushed it a lot more, certainly in the second half of the year. But what were you supposed to do? Like take them out of the rotation, add a sixth man to skip them? I mean, 180, it's a high number these days, but I don't know what other option you want. Like, unless next year the Mets should just employ a six-man rotation. And if that's what they're going to do because of Kodai Senga, or that's what they're going to do because they felt the rotation ran out of gas, then you got to start to think about what we're paying an ace like Burns or Max Fried, because now they're making fewer starts. Like, if you do the math, you got 162 games. If you've got 6 starters, that guy's making 27 starts as compared to the 32 starts. Now there are 5 fewer starts. Now, I still think there's a great value in having an ace, but you're cutting down on the amount of times that they actually pitch. If the Mets have a really good year next year, and look, we all hope that, then you can be kind of more careful when it comes to August and September and making sure guys are fresh. But David's right. I mean, the Mets were playing balls to the wall since June 1st. They really didn't have an option other than doing that. And look, if everybody ran out of gas at the end of the year, if that's the excuse we're going to make, and I do think there is some reality to that, there's nothing you could have really done differently.
Attitude or mindset toward signing other teams' players who have the qualifying offer and the draft pick cost of that as well.
Yeah, it's part of the equation. It's part of the valuation of how much we're going to pay the player, trying to evaluate alternatives on the market as well. Again, there are no absolutes, so I could imagine scenarios where we sign one qualifying offer player or multiple qualifying offer players. I could also imagine scenarios this offseason where we don't sign any qualifying offer players and maintain our draft position. So I really think it's very early to determine how any of these scenarios play out.
This free agent market, it's okay to sign guys who've been offered the qualifying offer. A, you feel the team is closer to winning, and B, the players are good enough. You don't want to hand out a draft pick when the player is on a short-term deal or you're just doing it because he's the best player in that particular market. So for me, when you're looking at Corbin Burns and you're looking at Juan Soto, and even if you're looking at a guy like Alex Bregman, those guys are worth giving up a draft pick. This market, to me, makes it okay to give up the draft pick. So I could see a scenario in which they're signing multiple players that were made the qualifying offer.
Team, I think, won 96 games, but didn't get off to a particularly good start for a team that won 96 games. Is there anything to look at there, or do you think that was just the luck of the way it worked out? I mean,
what, including postseason?
Yeah.
I was like, well, you gave us some extra.
But you're 89 at least in the regular season. And,
yeah.
And you didn't look like an 89-win team for the first month and a half.
No, we did not. I think for the last 4 months of the season, we probably looked like a 100-win team. We were probably playing at about a 100-win pace. So, look, this is why we play 6 months. I generally think that your record after 6 months is a pretty good indication of your talent level, of how you played. And I think that was true for us this year. We played, I think, under our expectations for the first 6-8 weeks of the season. And then, fortunately, we turned it on with enough time left to get us to the playoffs.
First of all, to John Heyman, who asked that question, who does that? Where you have the win total of the regular season, you tack on the playoff wins, and then you're just so matter of fact of, hey, you won 96 games. 96. On what planet did the Mets win 96 games? Well, you're just adding the number up. The only time I ever heard that, where you openly talk about the combined win total of the regular season and the postseason, was probably the 1998 Yankees, the greatest team I've ever seen, where they won the 114 in the regular season, and they just tacked on the 11 and said they won 125 games. That's the only time I ever heard that. So very odd question from John. And as far as what the Mets were last year, here's why it doesn't matter anymore. Can I tell you why that's an irrelevant question? It ain't last year anymore. The team is going to be very different on a lot of levels. I just talked about how their rotation features their 3 top innings guys. They're all free agents. Kodai Senga, who may turn out to be the leading innings guy in 2025, barely pitched in the regular season. There obviously can be major changes when it comes to the lineup. It's such a different team. So trying to diagnose, were you guys really a crappy team? Were you really a 90-win team? Were you really a 100-win team? Who the hell cares? That's for the Rico. That's for the kind of looking back at the season kind of stuff. I don't think it really matters moving forward.
What went into the Phil Maton decision?
I think just at this stage of the offseason, wanting to keep our options open a little bit, both in terms of how we're going to structure our bullpen, who those people are, and where we're going to spend our resources in our pen. I talked to Phil, expressed interest in keeping in touch. I think he feels the same way. And he's a good pitcher. Whether it's with us or elsewhere, he's going to be just fine.
Yeah, the simple answer is we think that we don't want to just be committed to paying him the $7.5 million. Let's put him back on the market. Let's see what his price tag is. Let's see if we could spend that $7.5 million maybe more wisely for a reliever. And we just don't think Phil Maton's worth that. That's really what it comes down to. But, yeah, I think there's a chance he comes back. We saw that with Adam Ottavino a couple of years ago. But the Mets and David Stearns really have that blank canvas when it comes to the bullpen. The only guys that I would look at and say, hey, they're in the bullpen in 2025 would be Edwin Diaz and Dednell Nunez and Reed Garrett. It's not a very long list of guys that you would look at and say they're in the bullpen in 2025. And even those guys I just mentioned, should they even really be locks after Edwin Diaz?
That's like more like a triangle of trust, not a circle of trust.
Yes. Well, they'll add guys. I mean, look, they I don't know how aggressive they're going to be in spending, but Clay Holmes, Tanner Scott, there's some pretty damn good relievers out there. And who knows, maybe Jose Buto's back in the bullpen. There's certainly a lot of options. Here is the final question that was asked to David Stearns in this part 1 edition, because trust me, he spoke for 3 straight days. These are his answers from day 1, but here's his final answer and question from day 1 of talking to David Stearns.
The right fielder was pretty solid and very good in the playoffs. Are you open to adding a right fielder?
We'll evaluate the entirety of the free agent market. And, certainly Starling did a great job for us in the playoffs, and happy he's coming back.
Yeah, that laugh tells you everything. That laugh is like, come on, what are we doing? I know we're not going to comment on specific players, but I see what you're doing there. Are you interested in a right fielder? We're flying to California to basically write a blank check for a right fielder. So, yeah, I think we're kind of open to it. I think it's a possibility. David Stearns was asked a lot of questions over the few days at the general manager meetings. On the next edition of the Rico Brogna, we analyze a lot of questions he was asked about the younger players. Ronnie Mauricio's mysterious injury, Jet Williams, the future. A lot of questions in that regard, plus more with David Stearns in part 2 of the Listening to David Stearns edition of Rico Brogna. We do appreciate you listening, subscribing, and downloading. You can always interact with the pod, thericob@gmail.com. I am collecting a lot of emails with people's plans for the offseason, a lot of trade ideas, a lot of free agent debate. We will certainly read a lot more of those emails over the next few Rico Brognas. But thank you very much for listening, downloading, and subscribing to another edition of Rico Brogna.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Rico Brogna podcast. It's amazing, isn't it? Make sure you download it now to keep it on you at all times.